The English ministers could no longer help confessing to themselves that the commotions which ever since the Peace of Amiens they had predicted as inevitable in France had not only not happened, but on the other hand, things had taken such a contrary turn that the man whose ruin they had considered as certain had succeeded in forming such a bundle as already threatened the existence of England. The ministers judiciously abandoned the illusion into which they had at first been led when they were induced to make peace, and afterwards to break it. They had doubtless observed that the wonderful restoration of things in France, and that in so short a time was purely the work of a mighty genius, which conceived, arranged, and executed with the rapidity of thought. At the first consul was the legislator, the magistrate, and the absolute master of a country and of an army, of which he was at the same time the general and the first soldier. That it was consequently at him that the blow which was to preserve England from ruin ought to be aimed, and that the success of this single blow would suffice to plunge France back into the abyss of calamities from which he had drawn her, and to sink her to that depth to which the powers of the continent that had made war upon her could not reduce her. The success of such a scheme would have produced consequences too positive to admit of any hesitation respecting the choice of the means calculated for ensuring it. They were accordingly sought in human passions. I have now to treat of the conspiracy of George Cadoul, and the singular part which the friends of General Moreau wished him to take in it. For his own person, far from being desirous to promote the plan, he was so averse to it as to be in some measure the cause of its failure. Ever since the Peace of Luneville, General Moreau had lived almost unknown. He kept aloof from the government, a love of retirement and indifference, perhaps affected, to honors which could not exalt him above the second rank, and a real aversion to every kind of employment had led him to adopt this mode of life. Those who knew him can admit, without the least prejudice to his good qualities, that General Moreau was most unfit for business requiring assiduous attention, that he possessed but very limited information which rendered him incapable of governing, and that, nevertheless, the contempt which he affected for honors was but a kind of distinction which he had assumed, and by which a courtier could scarcely have been deceived. One might have said to Moreau, as to Diogenes, "I see thy pride through the holes in thy cloak." With great firmness in danger, he united a weakness of character in private life which rendered him the most accessible and the most easily persuaded of men. As he occupied himself but little with business, his judgment was slow, his foresight short, and he had need of assistance in his determinations. Hence his kindness to persons who at length acquired control over him, and who, under the veil of friendship, ruined him by endeavoring to make him subservient to their own ambition. Soon after his return from the army to Paris, General Moreau, at the instigation of his pretended friends, attempted to lecture the first consul on politics, organization, administration. The trial which he made of his influence failed, and perceiving what sort of character he had to deal with, he never recurred to those subjects. In consequence, with the exception of a few wrongheads, all the generals and officers of his army pursued the right line of the respectful obedience due to the head of the government. Moreau had at length retired to his estate to enjoy the wealth which he had acquired in the service of his country. Other generals of that army who had amassed money lived in like manner in mansions which they had purchased, and strove to habituate themselves to a country life. Some of them were early disgusted with it, and not having been able to obtain appointments on the first formation of the army of the coast, they had turned grumblers. Others lived in repose because they had expressed a wish to be left in the enjoyment of it, but both put on the look of ill-used persons, which gave them a position that cost but little and was favorable to their plan of keeping aloof. At a distance, the eye of the observer confounded all these people with General Moreau and made out of them an opposition party which had even acquired a sort of luster from all the frothy declamations that were put forth on the impossibility of the success of the enterprise of Bologna. There had been persons silly enough to advise Moreau not to compromise his glory by mixing himself up in such a mess, and he had been weak enough to listen to this advice ever since the rupture of the Treaty of Amiens. That is to say, upwards of a year, we had remarked that he had not appeared at the Tuileries, even on occasions when not only decency but the duty of a citizen as well as a soldier would have dictated the propriety of his attending there and offering his services. General Moreau could not be considered as a private individual, which he affected to appear. And when cities and whole provinces filled with generous indignation imposed on themselves the sacrifices required by the most unparalleled aggression that had ever been witnessed, and those provinces sent deputies from all quarters to convey their offerings and their good wishes to the head of the government, was it the duty of General Moreau to remain an indifferent spectator of the new dangers of his country? Was he another Achilles whom Agamemnon ought to have solicited to resume his arms? And if he had been disposed to obey the orders which there might have been occasion to give him, ought he not, after the line of conduct which he had held, to have transmitted an assurance to that effect if he had not thought it his duty to offer it in person? It was such advice as this that his friends ought to have given him. But he wrapped himself up in silence, and we shall soon see why he could not break it. He had lent an ear to counsels which flattered his indolence, and it was doubtless the perverse temper into which it was but too well known that this general had fallen, which gave to the agents of England, vulgarly called Vendéans, and the idea of attempting to bring about a union that antecedent circumstances appeared to have rendered impossible between General Moreau and General Pichegru. Fouché, who was no longer minister, caused Moreau to be haunted by men of his province. And the same time of his party, he closely watched to discover his sentinels for the purpose of influencing and taking advantage of them upon occasion. But I believe he was a stranger to the plan of an accommodation between the Vendéans and Moreau, because the character of the latter did not offer a sufficient guarantee for him in case of the success of that party. But I believe, too, that he would have urged it himself had he seen a possibility of reviving the Republic by the overthrow of the first consul, which at that period would not have been impracticable. Perhaps, too, Mr. Fouché had no other intention than to induce serious circumstances in order to provoke the necessity of reestablishing a ministry which had been suppressed and which he considered his appanage. The aversion of Moreau to the Vendéans was the consequence of his opinions, perhaps, too, fear of the revision of his conduct in 1797 towards his comrade Pichegru prevented his compliance with the solicitations of the latter. A staunch Republican, he turned a deaf ear to every proposal incompatible with the existence and the restoration of the Republic. Having known him intimately, I am convinced that he did not communicate to the government the proposals that were made to him because he was persuaded that Pichegru's plan was so extravagant that he should have had nothing to do but to fight him the next day after that general should have overthrown the first consul. It did not appear possible to Moreau that any other but himself could be invested with the consular power. He therefore suffered Pichegru to proceed under the conviction that it was for him, Moreau, he was laboring. And this it was that caused Pichegru, when speaking of Moreau, to observe, "It seems that fellow has ambition too." After I was invested with the ministerial authority, I had the means of ascertaining that the first consul owed his life at that period solely to the diversity of plans of the two intrigues, both which aimed alike to destroy him, but with wholly different objects. It was during their disunion that a knowledge of them was obtained and all their plots discovered. For some time, dark rumors had been afloat, and without affording the certainty of a completely organized conspiracy, they still gave warning that something was going forward, which it was daily more and more important to sift to the bottom. 1,000 sinister reports were circulated as if to prepare the public mind for some event. The possibility of arresting the political career of the first consul was talked of. Letters from London even stated that he would be assassinated and that the information was derived from an authentic source. The certainty of this intelligence, though it was not incontestable, was nevertheless sufficient to excite the alarm and consequently to deserve the attention of the government. There was not at this time, as I have observed, any minister of police. It was a councillor of state who directed the investigation of everything relative to the general surveillance, and whose operations were carried on in concert with the grand judge. At this period, I received a letter from one who had formerly been a Vendéan chief, whom I had laid under obligation, and who had now no other wish than to live in quiet on his estates. He informed me that he had just been visited by a band of from 30 to 40 armed men who had come to talk to him about the follies which he had heartily renounced ever since the 18th Brumaire, and that as well to keep the promise which he had then given, as to secure himself against the consequences which might result from this event, he lost no time in apprising me of it, adding that in order to keep out of danger, he should repair to Paris as soon as the vintage was over. I laid this letter before the first consul, who judged from the stamp of truth which it bore that I should probably obtain some particulars concerning this matter which began to engage his attention, and that at any rate it would be well to ascertain the political sentiments of La Vendée in circumstances which might become aggravated in consequence of the events that were preparing. I set out, therefore, incognito and went to my Vendéan chief, who furnished me with further details. And at my reiterated proposal, we both set out after I had disguised myself in quest of the band which he had mentioned in his letter. On the third day, we saw some men belonging to it, and who had parted from it the day before. And from them we obtained all the details requisite to enable me to form a judgment of its designs. This band was headed by 2 men who had recently landed on the coast. It scoured the country, announcing a speedy change in affairs and giving notice to people to hold themselves in readiness for this moment. I actually saw the peasants numbering themselves by small districts as if preparing for an insurrection. Some of them even said to me in their jargon, "Comment?" That's French. "What am I to do? I have no guns. The Blues have taken them away." It is well known that this was the name of which the Vendéans denominated the Republicans. In this country, I had occasion to ascertain that this unhappy country was still capable of suffering itself to be again set on fire. And I also convinced myself that many Vendéan chiefs whom we supposed to possess a great moral power in those parts had entirely lost all consideration with the people on account of their connection with the government. I was told repeatedly that none of them would be able to excite insurrection in the country, but that it was probable that this time it would be George himself who would come, and some even went so far as to say that it was not believed he would run the risk of coming through Bretagne, where everybody was sold, meaning that they would betray him, but that he would probably come by Normandy. I saw evidently from the hopes which they entertained on the subject that he was the only man who could yet inspire them with any confidence and excite them to insurrection. I returned with this gentleman to his mansion, whence I set out the following day for Paris. Chapter 3. These particulars greatly surprised the first consul, who began to be uneasy at not having heard from me since I left Paris. He said some flattering things to me about my courage and resolution in running such dangerous risks, and he certainly set them down to my credit. He then determined to employ severe measures to elicit truth from darkness. He had an inconceivable tact for judging when he was upon a volcano and for laying his finger on the precise spot where anything was to be discovered. Since he had been at the head of the government, trials by council of war had been extremely rare. He had even entertained the intention of suppressing them, excepting in cases of military discipline. There were nevertheless in the prison several persons detained by the police as spies or charged with political machinations, and they were not ordered for trial because the first consul said that the time would come when no further importance could be attached to those intrigues, and they might be then set at liberty. On this occasion, he desired to be shown the list of all those persons with the date of their apprehension and notes of their different interior circumstances. Among them was a man named Picot and another named Le Bourgeois, who had been apprehended a year before at Pont-Audemer in Normandy. That's coming from England. On their departure from London, a description of their persons had been given by an agent whom the police kept there and who had learned from themselves the atrocious design with which they were going to France, and which was nothing less than to assassinate the first consul. The government had hitherto contented itself with keeping them in prison. The first consul directed that they and 3 others should be tried. They were brought before a commission. The first mentioned 2 manifested an obstinacy that was not expected. They refused to answer and were condemned and shot without making the slightest confession. They seemed even determined to defy authority and perish, declaring that it would not survive the war. This bravado diminished the painful impression which an execution always produces. Not a single step had been gained. The first consul nevertheless directed the trial, for which he had given orders to be deferred. The government being obliged to have recourse to inquiries concerning a design, the existence of which it guessed had excited the zeal of all the functionaries. These set on foot inquiries, and Mr. Xi, uncle of the Duc de Feltre, and prefect of the Lower Rhine, gave notice of an intrigue which wore an alarming appearance. He had ascertained that the English resident of the court of Württemberg kept up an extensive correspondence on the right bank of the Rhine, that he was continually traveling and frequently visited a party of emigrants who had recently thrown themselves into the territory of Baden and into the vicinity of Offenburg. He encouraged them, succored them, and assured them that there would be a speedy change in France. He had moreover foreign auxiliary, a Baroness von Reich, who lived at Offenburg, and who had long figured in all the counter-revolutionary plots. It was well known that the resident was capable of, it was determined to penetrate his intentions and the plans which he had formed, and a cunning, insinuating emissary was dispatched to intoxicate him with hopes, wormed from him the secret of the connections which he kept up with the interior, and fascinated him to such a degree that the diplomatist proposed to associate him in his designs. The emissary assented. He weighed and discussed the chances which the enterprise presented, and pleaded falsehood to come at truth, obtained all the information that he wanted, and set out for Paris, furnished with large sums of money, which he had the address to draw from the credulous envoy. The designs which he reported were too paltry to deserve notice. Nothing was learned from his mission. We were obliged to seek other sources of information. The first consul reverted to the prosecutions which he had suspended. He ordered the list to be laid before him. It began with a person named Querelle. Who is this man? Inquired. He was told that he was a native of Bas-Bretagne, who had served under Georges in La Vendée. Having arrived at Paris about 2 months before, he had been apprehended upon the denunciation of a creditor whom he was unable to pay, and who in revenge gave information to the government concerning him. This man knows something, or I am very much mistaken, rejoined the first consul. It was impossible that Querelle, under all the circumstances of his case, could escape condemnation. He was actually condemned, but the sentence awakened reflections, for next day, when preparations were making to conduct him to execution, he declared that he had disclosures to make to the first consul which concerned his life. The execution was deferred. The officer commanding the picket came to acquaint the aide-de-camp on duty with the disposition in which Querelle was. The aide-de-camp in his turn reported it to the first consul, who sent him to receive the declaration. It was circumstantial, precise and dispelled the cloud which still enveloped the meditated assassination. Querelle, in fact, declared that he had been at Paris for 6 months past, and that he had come from England with George Cadouel and 6 other persons whom he named. They had since been joined by 14 more who had likewise come from England and had been put on shore by a cutter of the English Royal Navy. They had all been landed at the foot of the cliff of Biville, near Dieppe. They had been met by a man from Eu, or Treport, who had conducted them to some distance from the coast to a farmhouse, the name of which was unknown to him. They had afterwards proceeded from farm to Paris, which they entered singly, and where they never showed themselves but when they were summoned by George. Thus George had been at Paris 6 months, and what had hitherto happened but an empty rumor acquired peculiar importance by this disclosure. Since the restoration of internal tranquility, the police had kept lists of all the persons who had borne a part in civil commotions or had excited notice in districts where diligences had been robbed or any other acts of that nature committed. These lists were divided into several classes. First, the instigators. Second, the actors. Thirdly, the accomplices. Fourthly, and lastly, such as had favored the escape of any of these persons. The table for Eu and Treport noted a watchmaker named Troche as having formerly been an emissary of the party. He was now, to be sure, grown old, but his son was capable of supplying his place. The gendarmerie were ordered to apprehend and bring him to Paris. The suspicion proved well founded. This young man of 18 or 19 was recognized by Querelle, and being equally acute and ingenuous, he easily guessed on seeing the latter the subject on which he was to be examined. He sought not to deny a fact which was too palpable to be disputed. Besides, his part had been so simple that he would not run the risk of making himself more culpable by a denial, which in any case could not have been of the least personal benefit to him. He related all that he had done, all that he had seen or heard, that he had conducted Messieurs de Polignac to Biville, where they had passed the day in the house of a sailor, that he had gone to them again at night to take them to the farmhouse, which formed the first stage on their route to Paris. The details fix the opinion that was to be entertained of this enterprise. Troche had declared that 3 disembarkations had already taken place, and that there was to be a 4th in the evening of the very next day. The circumstance was immediately communicated to the first consul. He sent for me into his cabinet, where I found him measuring with a pair of compasses the distance from the different points of the coast of Normandy from Paris. He explained to me the business in hand and made me set off without delay to secure the persons concerned in this new landing, and he directed me to return by the route followed by these little parties, and to explore myself these different focuses of disturbance. I set out at 7 in the evening, followed by a wagon from the stables of the first consul, which was full of gendarmes d'élite. I took young Troche along with me because the party would not have landed unless it had perceived him on the shore. On the road he related his adventures to me with the utmost frankness. He had but just discovered that he had been employed in intrigues which might have brought him to the scaffold, and he showed as much zeal in laying a snare for those who were coming as he could have done to serve those who had already passed. I had the powers of the Minister of War for any case that might occur. I had no apprehension of any impediment. I arrived at Dieppe next evening after dark, that is to say 24 hours after my departure from Paris. I instantly demanded the signals of the coast. The only information they furnished was that an enemy's cutter continued to hover off Treport. This I communicated to Troche, who told me that it was the same from which the landing was to be effected, and which had already brought 3 other parties. She kept in this position that she might be able, with a single tack, to reach the foot of the cliff where she was accustomed to put the people ashore. He promised, when he should have seen her by daylight, to give me more positive information. The sea was very rough and by no means favorable for the coming ashore of a boat upon a coast studded with reefs. Nevertheless, I would not stay at Dieppe. I disguised myself and set out on horseback for Biville, taking with me young Troche, as well as my gendarmes, who were also disguised. They were all men of tried courage. With such men one might run all risks without uneasiness. I made them alight at some distance from Beville. I've sent the horses to the inn, and before I pushed on further, I waited till my little party, which had orders not to show itself, had rejoined me. It soon came back. We set out under guidance of Troche, who led us to a house which was the habitual resort of the emissaries thrown on the coast by the English packets. There they warmed and refreshed themselves and made arrangements for proceeding to the first stage, which, being several leagues inland, was beyond the circle of the habitual surveillance of the authorities. Situated at the extremity of the village, which faces the sea, the house offered to those who frequented it the advantage of being able to enter and leave it unseen by anyone. In the garden of this cottage I posted myself with my people. I listened for any sound indicative of the steps of men, when I perceived through a small window a large table on which were placed wine, pies ready cut, and a large lump of butter. I called Troche and pointed out to him these preparations. It is the collation, he said, which is usually given to those who arrive from the coast. If they are not come, they will be here presently, for the tide is about to ebb. If they miss the moment for disembarking, they will not be able to get ashore today, because the reefs prevent boats from landing. Time pressed. I determined to enter the house without exactly knowing what was in the second room, the door of which I saw. I had with me a gendarme whose courage was proof against every danger. I ordered him to follow me, to post himself at that door, and not suffer it to be opened till all his comrades should have entered. I had decided on instantly closing the first, fully persuaded that, let the cottage contain what it would, with men so determined I should carry my point. My arrangements being made, I desired Troche to go in, keeping my eye fixed on him, to watch lest any look, any sign might betray us. The precaution was superfluous. The sailor's wife, not doubting for a moment that we had just landed, asked Troche how many he had brought. Troche replied that he had not come from the coast, but was going thither. Well, she said, you will find there little Pagiot de Pauly, who has been gone this hour after waiting for you a long time. I was curious to know who this Pagiot could be. He was a comrade of Troche's, who sometimes came to the beach, but had in general no other duty to perform than to guide the persons who landed to the second station and to carry their luggage. The good woman was alike ignorant of what had befallen Troche, and who I was. I hastened out of the house to proceed to the coast, where the landing was at the very moment supposed to be taking place. From Beville to the shore it is but a few minutes' walk. The ground was covered with snow, and we had the wind in our faces. We were walking cautiously along when we heard someone speaking a few paces ahead of us. Troche fancied that he recognized the voice of Pagiot. But as the night was dark and the conversation was held in a hollow, it was impossible to judge of the number of the interlocutors. I placed my gendarmes in ambush behind the avenue by which they were coming, and took post myself at the spot by which they were obliged to debouch in order to reach the house of the sailor. There were but two of them. Nevertheless, I gave the signal. My men sallied from their ambush and seized them. Their sudden appearance frightened the villagers and gave themselves up for dead men. But Pagiot perceived Troche, took courage, and informed us that he was returning from the coast, that the boat had not been able to land because the surf ran so high, and that the crew had told them they should come ashore the next day. Every evening for 2 or 3 days past they had been trying to land, but the sea had always been too rough. The foot of the cliff was covered with reefs. A boat could not approach but during flood tide, and when the water was calm. I passed the rest of the night in the house of the sailor, and went at daylight with Troche to reconnoiter the enemy's cutter, which he knew to be the one for which I was looking out. The vessel bore away from the shore as soon as day began to dawn, but stood in tacking at dusk, and took her station opposite to the signal tower on the coast, washed by a wide and deep ravine, at the extremity of which was fixed a rope, known in the neighborhood by the appellation of the smuggler's rope. This rope, with the thickness of a merchantman's cable, was fixed perpendicularly against the cliff, which at this place rises abruptly to the height of 250 feet. It was fastened to stout stakes driven into the ground at intervals of 6 feet. The person who ascended last coiled it up and hung it on a post destined for that purpose, lest it should be seen by the patrols who might be watching along the coast. This method of smuggling must be very ancient, for this rope seemed to me to be a regularly organized establishment. It had its superintendent whose duty it was to keep it in order, and the smugglers punctually paid the charge imposed upon them for the use of it. Never did danger appear to me so imminent as that incurred by a man thus scaling the cliff with a load on his shoulders. Had but one of the stakes given way, it had been all over with the smuggler, and with the smuggled goods, too. It was this way that George and his companions had come to France, and certainly no one would have dreamt of a passage effected within less than 100 paces of a signal tower, inhabited by watchmen who, it is true, retired at night. I made some painful reflections on witnessing the 1,000 dangers which men were not afraid to encounter in order to sell a few prohibited commodities, and above all to commit a crime which in its result could not change the situation of any who undertook it. This excited my curiosity to learn how far these people knew what it was they had been induced to do, and I was soon convinced that they suspected that they were doing wrong, but none of them ever thought of making the least inquiry on the subject. This rope was an income to the most needy, as it produced them a good deal. They kept it up with care, but not one of them strove to penetrate what had not been told him. They respected all the secrets of others, that the secret which afforded them a livelihood might be respected, and they were more affected at the suppression of that rope than at having been instrumental in introducing George into France. For the rest, they all firmly believed that it was only smugglers they had been aiding. No attempt was therefore made to punish them as accomplices in an offense of which they had no suspicion. I returned in the evening to the coast and posted myself at the outlet of the defile, but the sea continued to be rough. I passed 6 or 7 nights waiting for a landing which could not be effected. I had been 28 days in this position when I received orders to return to Paris. Chapter 4. While I was at Dieppe, the police had continued the inquiries which it was making in Paris. It had not only gained knowledge of each of the emissaries who had followed George, but had found means to secure them all, from the leader to the meanest individual of the expedition. These apprehensions had broken the silence in which the first of them were wrapped. The newspapers in which they were mentioned had reached England, whence a warning was instantly sent to the cutter cruising off Dieppe, where, fortunately for her passengers, the unfavorable weather had prevented their being landed. The cutter proceeded to the coast off Morbihan, where we shall presently meet with her again. I remained some days in the environs of Dieppe and returned to Paris. I was surprised at my arrival to find what activity had been exerted to secure George and his followers. The cavalry of the guard and that of the garrison furnished guard posts on the outer boulevards and had vedettes round the wall enclosing the capital, continually moving from one towards the other. The latter formed permanent patrols who had orders to apprehend everyone who should seek to scale the walls for the purpose of gaining the country. A corresponding measure had been taken at the barriers. Everyone going out at them was most rigidly examined. But this was not all. A law had been enacted enjoining every citizen to declare what persons were lodging in his house, and pronouncing the penalty of death against anyone who should harbor George's accomplices. Such measures might be expected to produce disclosures, and this expectation was not disappointed. All the individuals who had belonged to this association were soon known. A list of their names with a description of their persons was printed and posted up in Paris and all over France, where no one could now travel, even with passports, without being examined from head to foot. From the disclosures of some of the persons apprehended, it was discovered that General Moreau was no stranger to the enterprise. The presence of George and of several persons whose high birth might have been expected to keep them aloof from such a man left no doubt of the existence of a conspiracy, or at the end at which it aimed. It seemed too serious to forbid the idea that the conspirators had neglected nothing in order to associate General Moreau in their schemes. This conjecture appeared the less improbable as the line of conduct which that general affected to hold strengthened the suspicions which already arose respecting his fidelity to his old political principles. George's servant declared that one evening he went out in a hackney coach with his master, who was accompanied by a little lame general whose name he knew not, and by another person who was also a stranger to him. He added that on their arrival at the Boulevard de Madeleine, the little general alighted and went to fetch General Moreau from his house, Rue d'Anjou. That his master and the other person then alighted, and both walked about with General Moreau while he and the little lame general waited in the coach. When they returned to the coach, he heard the person who accompanied his master, and speaking of General Moreau, observed, "It seems that fellow has ambition too." The grand judge made an official report in council on this circumstance, and orders were issued for the apprehension of General Moreau. He was taken on the bridge of Charenton as he was returning from his country seat, Grosbois, and conducted to the temple. His secretary also was secured, but Fouché, who probably had his reasons for not investigating too closely the conduct of Frenier, this was the name of the secretary, set every engine to work to procure his liberation. He feigned zeal, affected a regard for forms, and told the first consul that when one had a good job in hand, it was a pity to spoil it by arbitrary measures and injustice. That Frenier had been apprehended, though he was not accused, nor was anything laid to his charge. "You must," said he, "show yourself equitable and release that man." The first consul fell into the snare, notwithstanding the remonstrances of the police who wished to detain Frenier for a week. He was set at liberty. No sooner was he released than he was deeply compromised by the depositions of all those whom George had brought into contract with the persons about General Moreau. Search was made for him again, but too late. He was already in safety. This circumstance excited suspicions of Monsieur Fouché, but as he was already known to be a man of very light character, they led to nothing further. Fouché followed with particular anxiety the inquiries made under the direction of Monsieur Real, and when he had caught up some new incident, he ran to retail it at the Tuileries. The first consul, who was sometimes amused by his wit, said, "You will stick to the police, then?" "I have retained some friends there," replied Fouché, "who furnish me with anything new." The conversation turned in this manner to the enterprise of George, the ramifications of which incessantly engaged the thoughts of the first consul, who liked to talk of them in confidence. Fouché seized everything that dropped from him and made it the groundwork of fresh inquiries. Placing himself in this manner between the head of state and the person who directed the investigation, it is scarcely possible but that he should find opportunities of promoting his private interest, and he cared not at whose expense he did that. But while flattering power, he was not unmindful of his brethren and friends of the good times, and used such language as this, that the first consul wanted no more patriots, that he permitted the emigrants to return for the purpose of making use of them, and other expressions of the like kind, which are sure to find acceptance in a city where nothing is lost. This plot against the life of the first consul produced a profound impression on the public opinion. The mind revolted at the bare idea of a project, the least important consequences of which would have been to plunge France back into the abyss of calamities from which she had scarcely escaped. The people were indignant at the means of execution which had been adopted, because in France they dislike assassination. Every department, every town of any consequence, nay, even La Vendée itself, sent a particular deputation to the first consul to congratulate him on the discovery of so odious a plot. These deputations could not find terms sufficiently strong to express the indignation which animated them and the attachment they felt for a man in whose preservation all France was interested. They invoked the vengeance of the law. They besought the First Consul for the sake of the future to turn a deaf ear to clemency. This was the unanimous cry of the whole public. Every functionary, whether present or at a distance, every officer of every rank whatsoever, and particularly all who aspired to favor, thought of nothing but how to avail himself of this circumstance to prove his devotedness to the person of the First Consul. I have often seen him weary of all that was said to him on this subject. He was nevertheless deeply affected by the demonstrations of attachment poured in upon him from all parts of France, as had previously been the case in regard to the infernal machine. This was just the time of his greatest power over the nation. The army assembled in the camps shuddered with rage at the mere idea of a design to take the life of him who it considered its guardian angel. Had General Moreau been sent before a council of war the day after the presentation of the report of the grand judge, it had been all over with him.